What's up, guys? Got like a relatively low effort video here, but I figured it'd be like a nice one to talk about, and I do think that there might be quite a bit to talk about. Basic premise for this one is core Justice League members versus like staple Marvel villains. And so just to like get it out of the way, I am going with I think what a lot of people consider to be like the core seven Justice League members. Although personally, I like heavily disagree with having Aquaman in the core seven. I think he just doesn't bring a lot to the table. I feel like when Aquaman's a part of like the Justice League, you have to have like obligatory underwater missions every now and then. I don't know. He just doesn't really bring much, and like I think he's better served as just like a king of the sea and get like Hawk Girl or Cyborg even in there, and it kind of balances the team out better. But that's just like a personal preference thing. I will be talking about it with Aquaman, who I think for like 99% of battles does not really add much. But it doesn't matter. He's still like a very strong character. He just gets like a little outclassed by Superman and Wonder Woman and whatnot. But like not an unimpressive character. And also, I'm not gonna be using like I guess like the most like heavily winked versions of the characters. I am gonna be talking about like I guess what I would consider to be composites, more or less like kind of where you see them in like an average case, in like in terms of how they normally perform in a fight. I think that generally people do lean towards like the highest like possible feats for each character. And I think that if you do, then almost like a no contest for most of these because Superman's like top end feats probably do beat most of these people with like a few exceptions. But that being said, like I think that like having like a fair, like relatively like tame and like a composite version of the characters is going to make it more interesting. But as I'm talking through, I'll talk about like the different cases. So just to make sure we're clear on this, I think S tier is going to be a character that like defeats the Justice League like pretty handedly, and then a D tier would be a character that more often than not would like lose pretty badly against the Justice League. And then in terms of the fight, like I'm going to be, I guess, kind of imagining like these characters all exist in the same universe, and like hypothetically, if they did, how would the Justice League fare in trying to stop them? So I guess like that might entail that if it's a villain that tends to use prep time, then we'll give them a little bit, but we'll also give the superheroes knowledge of the character, So I'm going to talk about it like kind of holistically. I think it's more exciting than just going by and saying like if we plop them all in arena, who would win? Because then we get to have characters like Batman and Doctor Doom kind of show uh, you know, their true potential. And also, I'm realizing when I made this list, I think I accidentally got doubled up on versions, maybe even tripled up on a few characters here, right? I see two nulls, two voids, two abominations. Okay, yeah, two beyonders. So we'll cut it off like somewhere here, before the characters repeat. So that's my mistake. But that being said, I think we've got a good list here. One thing that is worth noting is Marvel villains do I think tend to function a lot better in groups, at least compared to DC villains. Like I think that overall, I could probably think of more DC villains that are themselves like a decent enough threat for the Justice League to justify having the team. Whereas like with the Avengers, or like Avengers very specifically, a lot of their villains usually end up going into groups like the Masters of Evil and whatnot. But they still have like a few like pertinent physical threats. And then obviously, with the X Men, that is like a bit of an exception, right? Like I think that the X Men villains tend to be like the kind of characters that require a team. Okay, so that being said, we're just gonna get started, and we are going to start with Apocalypse. So Apocalypse is a very interesting character to talk about for this kind of stuff because he is one of the most like versatile characters, despite the fact that he doesn't always get portrayed as like using his full potential when it comes to it. But his list of mutant powers is like pretty endless, and a lot of that comes from his ability to kind of alter his physiology. That being said, how would I think he could like on average stack up against the Justice League? Now, Apocalypse is not a character that I think I would like give a crazy amount of prep time to. And to be fair, when I am saying this, I guess it's like so weird because now I'm thinking like if he's in DC, then will he have his four horsemen? And if he has his four horsemen, are they going to be Marvel characters? Whatever it is, right? Even then, like with like his access to like whatever like normal horsemen he like has access to, normally in like Marvel, I don't think it makes a big difference. I do think that Apocalypse is like a pretty like decently easy handled character. I don't think that Apocalypse really steps up to characters like Darkseid, in terms of strength. And like, a character like Darkseid obviously would give the Justice League a run for their money, but they are able to defeat him more times than they're not, and sometimes that is just a matter of Superman doing it himself. Once he like gets a little serious, but I think that Apocalypse does have like a good chance just on account of his adaptability, but like also at the same time, a lot of what we see Apocalypse doing is fighting characters who are not quite, I think, on average Justice League level. Obviously, X Men can get really strong. I'm not like saying that they're weak, but I think like on average, when the X Men are struggling with a character like Apocalypse, it's not Phoenix Force Jean Grey. It's not like full power Iceman or whatever. Like it's just like like slightly weaker versions of the characters, hence why they struggle, but they're still able to overcome him. Which is why I'm like pretty confident in saying that the Justice League would like probably be able to handle it pretty easily. Not so easily that I would say it's like a complete cakewalk for them. Obviously, Apocalypse is still like a very big physical threat and does have like a lot of versatility, but as much versatility as you have against a character like Superman, if you don't have kryptonite and you don't have magic, then your versatility kind of doesn't mean quite as much as it would otherwise. So that's good. And now, right off the bat with the next one, I think we're probably going to be talking about what is probably the hardest one to discuss. So let me just keep him here for now. Doctor Doom is very situational, right? Obviously, like incredible genius. So one of the characters, along with Batman, who probably does the most with prep time. And for that reason, I do lean towards him probably winning more times than he loses. But it's a little difficult, right? Because with a lot of the Justice League members, they do have, exploitable weaknesses. Even if you don't want to go like the Kryptonite route with Superman, like Red Sun stuff is obviously like a very big weakness for him. And Doctor Doom is certainly smart enough to be aware of like this kind of stuff and to like exploit it. So that being said, and like that's another thing is like Doctor Doom himself, aside from his incredible arrogance, doesn't really have any weaknesses. At the very least, he doesn't have any like physical weaknesses, and like not having a physical weakness is like a pretty big drawback because that's not something like a character like Batman can really like prepare for. Then the most I could imagine is Batman could probably egg Doctor Doom on, but if I'm being honest, I think that Doctor Doom probably gets done a little dirty more often than not in his comics. Like I get it, he's arrogant, that's like his downfall, but like sometimes it's like a little too silly. Like you can't have Doctor Doom losing every time because like Johnny Storm like calls him a few names and he like loses his mind. I think Doctor Doom is probably a little more resilient to that kind of like taunting, but writers tend to disagree with on like different like character elements like that. So who am I to say? That being said, like I do think that most of the excuse me, the Justice League do have like pretty exploitable weaknesses, and that's something we saw with Tower of Babel. Where the Bat computer got hacked and they had all the access to the different like weaknesses of the Core Seven. That being said, it is worth noting that I do think that maybe one of the more important factors in this fight is Wonder Woman. And I know that's like weird because Wonder Woman is not usually considered to be like as strong as Superman, as fast as the Flash. Normally she's like respected for being, probably the best fighter, but that only goes so far if your powers aren't that strong. But she is able to kind of carry the team here in that she does not have like a super exploitable weakness, right? She has no like equivalent of kryptonite. She has no well, I guess with Hal Jordan it depends, but like he's not gonna get gotten by like some sort of like fear-inducing gas. Flash, if you freeze the floor in front of him, he'll go flying, whatever it is, right? But Wonder Woman, I think, is like comparatively a lot more of like a solid all-around fighter. Even if she isn't quite as strong as the other heavy hitters, she is, makes up for it by not really having like a strict weakness. And I guess like there's a weakness of getting tied up by her lasso, but like that's like a weakness for anybody, and like what a hard thing to do in a fight, right? That being said, I think with prep time, and like assuming the Justice League are trying to maybe stop a plot by Doctor Doom, then I actually do think I would probably give it to Doctor Doom more times than it wouldn't, but definitely not like a complete stomp. I think Superman versus Doctor Doom is like a very interesting conversation, maybe for another time to go into deeper. But like in general, I think especially with prep time, Doctor Doom would like kind of have like an easy time dealing with Superman. He's just like such a well-rounded character in terms of his abilities, and like on top of all of that, he's certainly no slouch when it comes to magic. And Superman is not very good against magic. Doctor Doom being maybe second to Doctor Strange, like on average for like the human characters in terms of magic. One of the candidates for the Sorcerer Supreme becomes Sorcerer Supreme in a comic run, I believe. So overall, I actually do think Doomsday probably is one of those characters that can deal with the Justice League. And in fact, I think the fact that he doesn't more often than not deal with like the Avengers with equal like uh, ability is more so like on the writers. But that's just how it goes with comic books. So it can become a little difficult if like villains get a little dirty in that department. Dormammu is like a very hard character to talk about because like what does a direct fight with Dormammu look like? Is it in his realm? Is it on Earth? Because if it's on Earth, he has no power, and if it's in his realm, he has all the power. I think that if we're talking about Dormammu, we probably like just say like I guess we're assuming like it's in his dimension. And for that, it's like a complete stomp. The core Justice League does not have access to any like meaningful magic. Like obviously Wonder Woman has some magic, but like not not like Doctor Fate magic, right? And I guess with prep time, we're not saying like the Justice League in there like or like we're not going to give them any additional members. Like obviously they could recruit Doctor Fate, they could recruit whatever, but we are talking Core Seven versus the villain here. So that being said, I don't think there's much to talk about with Dormammu. Galactus, there's probably a little more to talk about. Again, it's like a matter of, are we talking about like a straight fist fight with Galactus? Galactus obviously, I mean, maybe not quite obviously, but I would say like more often than not, like wipes the floor with them. He's just like kind of this unstoppable force that usually just needs to be like sent out of bounds. Um, he's even able to tank hits from like Odin Force Thor, if I'm not mistaken. It might be Thor Force Thor. One of the like super powered versions of Thor, Galactus is able to like take hits from and like fight against back. So I think it's worth saying like I don't think that a punch from Superman is quite doing quite enough. Again, this is assuming like a relatively composite Superman. Like we're not going for the straight outerversal like literal concept of hope Superman that like shatters multiverses with a punch, right? This is like the average Superman we see when we like pick up a Justice League comic rather. And in that case, I do think Galactus would win. That being said, do I think that the Justice League would be able to find a way to out of bounds Galactus or make him leave? I'm actually still a little skeptical because while Batman is like a very smart character, and that might even be underselling it, he is not like Reed Richards. And that's one thing I think people kind of underestimate about Batman is like he is like generally very smart and like very like well learned, but he's not like he is probably far from like the best engineer or like scientific mind in DC, right? Like even if maybe all around he might be like comparable in like intelligence to a character like Mr. Terrific, like Mr. Terrific is going to just be like on average way better when it comes to inventing things or like in this case like dealing with the likes of Galactus. So I do think that without like somebody like Reed Richards or even like Lex Luthor, I would imagine might like have more of a chance here. It's a little hard for them to really come up with a way to out of bounds Galactus. Most I can think is maybe if like Green Lantern or Superman could like using a construct like lift him and move him, but that does seem a little difficult, and that's not like what is normally like how it goes down, right? In terms of like moving, nobody's like picked up Galactus and moved him somewhere else. So that's like a difficult question. And then like obviously, I think normally when people talk about Justice League Core Seven, it is Barry Allen Flash. Like if it was Wally West and we're like really wanking him, maybe he's got something in there in his repertoire that can like out of bounds Galactus, whether it's trapping him in the Speed Force or like taking away his kinetic energy or whatever. But Power of Cosmic can probably like prevent most of that from affecting Galactus, I think. And again, I'm not like going with the heaviest like craziest feats for each character anyway. But again, it is Barry Allen, so I think he's a little more limited in that department. I don't really talk much about Martian Manhunter, and like I feel bad about it because I do really like Martian Manhunter as a character, but like I just don't imagine him ever doing much more than Superman. And people are gonna say like, oh, you're capping Martian Manhunter is like such a strong character. But if I'm being honest, man, I feel like I've never read or just engaged with any like Justice League storyline whatsoever where Martian Manhunter really actually like came to the table and stood on business in any meaningful way. Like whenever he shows up, it's usually like thrown straight into a gas station. Gas station explodes, and then he's like out of commission for the rest of the fight. Like sometimes they'll need a telepath and he'll show up, and they'll be like, okay, that's pretty cool. And sometimes he doesn't even like reading people's mind. I don't know. Like I like the character. I think John's a really cool guy, but I do think he's like a pretty underwhelming Justice League member in terms of like fighting capabilities, especially against a character like Galactus. Or Doctor Doom, like anyone who has like that kind of energy projection, or in Galactus's case, like that level of just like control over the universe. The intangibility is not really going to do much. Hela. I kind of wanted to talk about Hela after I talked about Loki, so I'm just gonna move her down. Hyperion, probably a pretty easy stomp. I think Superman versus Hyperion is maybe debatable, but I would lean like on average more towards Superman. But once you add the other Justice League members, it's like forget about it. Like Hyperion will maybe put up a decent fight, but not enough to take him away from D tier. Um, Juggernaut is an interesting case. I do think in a straight slugfest, Juggernaut is like pretty on like he is maybe like the most dominant character that you can really talk about. Unlimited strength, unlimited sorry not unlimited strength, but unlimited durability and like a decent amount of strength to back it up. Problem is he does get out of bounds like pretty easily, and I think even Superman can do that himself, right? So assuming Superman is willing to bring him up to space and just toss him, then it's an easy clap. Um, if he's not, then maybe it's like a little more difficult. But even then, like Superman could probably just lift him up and keep him in air jail long enough for I don't know Batman to figure out a way to imprison him. But that being said, like as much as he is like a physical threat, and as much I do think he would give like a little bit of difficulty. He's just stupid and like very easy to out of bounds. But like I think that he's like as a physical threat, like comparable to Doomsday, which might be like a little controversial. He might not be quite as fast, but I think he has higher, well, maybe comparable levels of durability. They're both kind of like relatively infinite durability. It'd be an interesting fight to see. Right, it'd just take a very long time. I actually do think I talk about that on my channel. So if you're interested in that, you can probably go search through the videos. Kang is such a weird character when it comes to fights. There's always some like weirdness going on whenever he's involved, but like I don't think that the superheroes are really on average having like too much trouble fighting him. He's not really much of a physical threat, and even when he's like got his prep time, he always there's always some oversight. Um, but again, it's like really weird because like Kang isn't really like a straight fisticuffs type character, so it doesn't really seem fair to really even be like throwing him in this. Even with all the prep time in the world, I don't know. Kang's a weird character. I don't really want to talk too much about him. I can't even. I wouldn't even say I know enough about him to really like make a sound judgment on this. So if you disagree, please enlighten me. Okay, Loki is. I actually think that Loki, on average, is probably going to be a little too much for the Justice League to handle. Again, a big part of it is like their lack of magic. Would make someone like Loki like pretty hard to deal with. That being said, Wonder Woman does have like a lot of familiarity with magic, and so there might be like a case for her, kind of having a like the edge in that department. But I think like Loki has like a lot of tricks under his belt, and using those like his duplicates, his magical powers, and just in general he's like a pretty big physical threat too. Superman is like at a bit of a disadvantage given like the magic nature of him, and then like I think that Loki has the like the tricks under his sleeve to kind of like tango with like all of the Justice League at once. And especially like if you again like it really depends on what exactly we mean by prep time, but like obviously Loki is not usually showing up to a fight and going for like a 1v6, right? Or sorry, 1v7, whatever it is. But he could bring the destroyer suit. And I do think if Loki brings the destroyer suit, probably like a very low chance that the Justice League would win on average. That's just how I feel about it. I think that this one's like maybe like a little contentious, but I do think that like on average I would put Loki winning like maybe 6 out of 10. So maybe like consider it close, but I do think that Loki is just like a little much for these guys to deal with in terms of like what they bring to the table. That's one thing about the Justice League, the Core 7, is that despite having like at least like kind of varied powers, I don't think they really have like well, I mean, I don't think they have enough variety, right? Like I think that a good Core 7 for the Justice League would include like a magic user. Probably not Doctor Fate, like maybe a Zatanna, or Zatanna, I'm not sure how people say it, right? Like some sort of magical based character that can kind of like help them deal with, their magical problems. Again, Wonder Woman is kind of magical, but like obviously I mean like a magician type character. And that's what I'm saying, like, I don't think Aquaman really rounds out the team very nicely. I think he's just kind of there. These are very duplicate, and then like on the off chance that they do fight underwater, then like sure, he's pretty helpful. But I would much rather be talking about like if these guys had Doctor Fate on their side, and then this fight becomes like a lot more interesting because it's not just like, oh, they have access to magic and the Justice League isn't particularly good at handling that. Um, okay, so moving on, I think Hela is going to be like a very similar boat. Obviously, less tricks under her sleeve, but in terms of like raw magical power, she does like quite clearly outclass Loki. At least to my understanding. Like again, it's another character where I've never read a comic with Hela in it. I get impressions from what I hear online, and also like a little bit from the movie. But I think like the general consensus is like obviously she is stronger than like base Loki, base Thor, by like a significant enough margin. So I think that logically, if Loki's here, then we could probably put Hela as well. Only reason she doesn't go higher is because I do think that there is still like a bridge of strength between S tier and A tier here. Magneto, probably pretty easy to handle on average. It's not like an X Men situation where we're sending a man made out of metal to deal with him, right? Like Superman is not really going to take anything from Magneto. Like it's just going to be, I think, a pretty easy fight. Not to say Magneto's weak by any like measure, and a cool character, of course, but I just don't think he quite stacks up to. He's not quite up to snuff. And speaking to not up to snuff, we got a few here. Feels a little weird putting these guys in the same tier as Magneto and Hyperion, but the Justice League are like a pretty strong group. And again, that's like the thing with the like Marvel villains is like there's not a lot of them that are like physical threats in and of themselves enough to threaten all of like a superpowered team. But like working together, usually they stand more of a chance. But no, I even put Red Skull in here, even though he's like not even a physical threat whatsoever. Personally, I think I could probably beat up Red Skull. That's probably not true actually, but the point is like he is just a normal guy. I felt weird having a Marvel villain list without Red Skull. I guess I don't know. Maybe I didn't need to include him. Uh, okay, so we've only got about I think 8-ish more. Remember, this is where it duplicates, so we're not going to talk about it from there. Let's actually do a little bit. I want to work a little backwards here because we got some more fun characters here. Abomination is like the Hulk, but stupider. And like again, he's like very easy to out of bounds, but I actually think that he's probably even less of a like threat than an annoyance than Juggernaut. Because like, well, Juggernaut like you can't really knock him out physically, and because they don't have magic, they would need to find a way to like out of bounds him. With Abomination, like I do think Superman could probably just hit him hard enough to knock him out eventually. So not really worth talking too much about. I think this is the Wrecking Crew. I'm not really going to talk about the Wrecking Crew. Kind of like I'm not really going to talk about Beyonder. I don't think it really even matters what version of Beyonder. Whether it's like pre-retcon Beyonder or post-retcon Beyonder, he probably does like pretty handedly beat the Justice League. Again, like if you want to wank Superman or like a Wally West Flash to their absolute peaks, I do think it could actually get like a little more contentious because Beyonder post-retcon scaling is like a little more limited. But even then, like I do think that hard to make the argument that Beyonder should not be an S tier here. There's a character that just pretty typically lives in S tier on every list he's in. So yeah, okay. Sorry. I think Null got moved to the side. Null's another one of those characters that we don't really see too often, but like what we know of him, he is up there in terms of like characters like Galactus as well. Able to beat one of the Celestials. Actually, probably I think he killed a few Celestials, right? Just like an overall powerhouse, not the kind of character you really show up in Tango with in like a one-on-one and really expect to win. Also, like his powers are very cosmic, not the kind of thing that these guys can really like deal with in their base forms on average. On average, Gore the God Butcher, I do think like he's like more of a threat than the people in D tier, but just like he is just like one guy who's capable of like throwing hands with a character like Thor. But when it comes to like a whole team of characters like this, I think that they have it in the bag. I don't think Gore really brings anything to the table that's like so like hard for the Justice League to deal with. Nothing really like new for them. Just like a pretty strong guy. Not to like disparage him. I think he's a pretty cool character, but you know, yeah. Uh, Molecule Man's like very variable. This one really does just depend on mental state. Like obviously theoretically like a super refined like operating to his full potential, Molecule Man is like up here with the Beyonder. But on average, Molecule Man is like, he suffers kind of from like Sentry syndrome. Even worse, where like he's just so mentally unstable and just like unwilling to use his powers that like without clear direction from somebody like Doctor Doom, we got in Secret Wars 2015. He's just not really like as big of a threat. Right. So I mean I don't know how people I think when people talk about Molecule Man, usually they like to talk about like a full potential Molecule Man if he was really trying his best. But like, in like a typical story, I do think it just comes down to, they talk him down and they're like, all right, Molecule Man, like let's calm down, we'll go get you some help, and then they agree. But obviously, like you throw Molecule Man with somebody like Doctor Doom who's willing to manipulate him, and things get pretty tough for the Justice League. So I think most people would probably be happy if I left Molecule Man in S tier, so that's what I'm going to do. But no, obviously there's a lot of nuance to it. Okay, we're at our last three. Again, these are all duplicates. So uh, Void, Sentry, or just like Void, I guess. Uh, so people do say that Void scales above the likes of Molecule Man, and I'm a little skeptical about it. Like obviously we had that like panel or whatever, I think in Dark Avengers, where he like overwhelms Molecule Man. But again, Molecule Man is like such a variable character, right? Like that was not like a fully realized, like fully operating like Molecule Man. It was like a little scared, insecure Molecule Man. So like obviously that would give Void an edge. But that being said, Void is like pretty ridiculous. Um, Kind of not the character you beat like physically, almost ever. Would they be able to talk Bob out of it? Well, I'm like a little skeptical. The one advantage that I guess they would have is, Martian Manhunter does have his like telepathy, but if I'm not mistaken, I do think that the Void is like also a very powerful telepath. I feel like that's one of his like many abilities, but I could be wrong on that. Like maybe I'm not the biggest Void expert, but I think generally he's another character that's kind of stomping the Avengers out. And then we have Thanos. Does depend, right? I think we're going to talk about Thanos without Infinity Gauntlet, even though I think he probably has it here. No, that's just his normal glove. Whatever, yeah. Without Infinity Gauntlet, like, I think he's very comparable to Darkseid. I mean, personally, I think he's probably, like, a good bit weaker than Darkseid without the Infinity Gauntlet. I think he does need that Infinity Gauntlet to be, like, a real meaningful threat. Obviously, if he has it, then there's not much the Justice League can do, but no Infinity Gauntlet Thanos, I think that even Superman himself could probably pack up, but he just has the rest of the Justice League there for assurance. Ultron is a character that I think is very similar to Doctor Doom, but without I think like the core weakness of like the arrogance. You guys can let me know if you disagree with that, but I think like on average, Ultron is like a pretty cool and calculating machine, which is why I think he's probably my favorite Avengers villain. Um, Although I really like Doctor Doom as well. But like in terms of his ability to like make plans and to like kind of like have contingencies against people, he's like almost unparalleled as well. The only difference between him and Doctor Doom in that respect is that like he doesn't have access to magic, which could be like a bit limiting, especially against a character like Superman. But again, like in a world where he is knowledgeable of Superman and can uh, kind of exploit his red sun weakness, then probably has like a pretty good time. And then here's like the key is that I don't think the Justice League has a real good chance of beating him because they don't have like again Batman's like a very good all rounder in terms of intelligence, but he is not as tech savvy as well. Honestly, he's not as tech savvy as Tony Stark. He's not as tech savvy as like Hank Pym. He's not as tech savvy as even like within his own universe characters like the Atom or Cyborg, right? Like he is just he's very knowledgeable of tech and like he could probably like handle himself like a little well, but could he like overwhelm or figure out like a way to deactivate something as like advanced as Ultron? I'm incredibly skeptical. Especially like again if we're not giving him all the time in the world to prep it and we're like assuming like this is something where the Justice League are kind of thrown into this world-ending crisis where Ultron has like kind of taken control and they're trying to stop him. In that kind of situation, I do think that Ultron probably more times than not puts up like a pretty big threat. And again, a big part of it is like his physical body like matters so little in terms of fighting because he can have so many Ultron drones. He can throw his consciousness from one place to another, and that's not something Martian Manhunter can stop. That's not something like any of them can stop. Right. Obviously, the Flash is pretty fast. Maybe like in some sort of wink, he could run across the globe and just kill every Ultron block like a bot. but then maybe Ultron has like backups in some computer, right? Like that's why you need somebody who's very tech savvy to deal with a character like Ultron, and I just don't think Batman fills that niche. I feel bad. I feel like I maligned Batman quite a bit this discussion, but like I do think that he's just like a little. He's not like he just doesn't have. He doesn't bring everything to the table that you would like necessarily need to deal with some of these characters. Even in like the intelligence department, he's very good at what he does, but what he does is not always fully relevant to fighting, especially like the likes of Ultron. So that being said, I don't think there's any duplicates here, or I think these are only duplicates rather. Let me know what you guys think. This is just kind of like a short video. I'm trying to like get back into actually posting to this channel, so I might make some more in the future. I do think I'll probably do like a little inverse for Marvel characters fighting against DC villains, or sorry, like Avengers fighting against DC villains, which I think will probably be a little more interesting to talk about. But I guess we're gonna have to wait and see. So, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'll probably try to drop some relevant links in the comments, like maybe a link to this post and like a little Discord that you guys can join. But aside from that, hope you guys are all taking care of yourselves and enjoy the rest of your day.